You are listening to Therapeutic Astrology Podcast, and I'm so happy that you're with us today because we are joined by Dr. Laura Anderson, who is a psychotherapist, founder of a religious trauma resolution and recovery center, and author with a book coming. And I'm sure we will extend this biographical material because there's a lot of you have a lot of things going on, Laura, but I just wanted to say thank you for coming and welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Ah, good. So I've only been communicating with your assistant, so I'm feeling a little nervous.
I promise I'm very normal.
Okay, good. Your assistant was very sweet.
Good.
Okay, but so among what you have studied is the dynamics of power and control also in religion. And I just have this sequential question, because when I've looked at your biographical material, is it that you left religion and then became a therapist? Or were you a therapist while you were in a religion?
Yeah, I was a therapist while I was in religion.
Okay.
Whenever I moved from where I grew up to where I'm at now, I was kind of in that transitional process. I had just graduated from school to be a therapist, and I was really kind of actively getting out of religion at that point.
So when you say when you graduated, you were actively getting out?
Yeah, the
Okay.
term that so many people use is called deconstruction, where they start to kind of pull apart their beliefs and their faith system and question, what is it that I believe? Why do I believe this?
Yeah.
So I had been doing that for a few years at that point, but then also kind of having that extra space away from where I grew up, it gave me a bit more boldness to be able to kind of ask different questions and try different things.
Right. So how old were you?
Oh gosh. I was in my late 20s.
Okay.
Mid to late 20s is kind of when I started asking some of those questions, and then really ramped up when I moved to the South, Nashville, Tennessee in the United States.
Yeah.
So my late 20s. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I have also been very influenced by my religious background in a traumatic way, and I wanted to ask you this in the beginning: is how do we even have this conversation without defining ourselves as victims, but yet also acknowledging, well, I did learn to sacrifice my own needs and my security.
Yeah.
And so that I ended up being victimized, and it's not safe to live like that. But then talking about it now, not being bitter. Do you understand my question? Like, how do we talk about it in a good tone?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sometimes people misconstrue the word victim in the sense that they make it mean that this is how you are for the rest of your life. You act as though you are a victim. When in reality, if we look at when we are a victim of something, it's sharing a little bit about our position, something that happened to us. There is a difference between being a victim or being victimized and then living as a victim or living in what we might call a victim mentality. So to say maybe I was a victim of sexualized violence or I was a victim of religious abuse just simply shares that I was on the receiving end of this harmful, abusive, violating behaviors, theologies, beliefs, things like that. That's always going to be true, right? That's part of my story. It sounds like it's part of your story. I was a victim to that. But what we do with that, do I continue to live as that? Do I, that maybe I continue to give away my power, or I kind of wallow in pity, or I use that as an excuse to treat other people poorly? I would say that is living as a victim or living within victim mentality, where I would say that's probably the unhealthy piece of it.
Sure.
But on the other hand, we can say, hey, I was a victim of this, and I'm also choosing to heal. I'm choosing to resolve how that trauma lives in my body. I'm choosing to recover from the things that happened to me so that that doesn't define me, right? Yes, that happened, but that is not the entirety of who I am. I am so much more than that.
But it's a beautiful answer, and I also feel it's like the right answer. But isn't it sometimes it comes through when you do unconsciously that because I mean for me at least there's a lot of anger there, and when
Yes.
the reason I want to say I'm not right now in any ex-religious group because I have visited one of those here in Denmark. The reason I'm not in it is because I feel that kind of bitterness, and I'm like, that's not going to help me grow. I recognize it in myself. There's anger underneath,
Yes.
there's sorrow, grief underneath, but it's actually not going to help me to, like you said, wallow in it.
Yeah, I think there's usually a period of time in our recovery process where it is very necessary to be very accurate and honest and kind of sit in that space for a little while. We want to sit there, we don't want to live there,
Yeah,
right?
good one. Yeah.
And so yeah, so we say, okay, I need to be accurate and honest about the things that have happened to me
Yeah.
because in so many religious spaces we have to deny and
Yes.
suppress
Oh, you're so right.
everything, right? And so there is something very important about being able to acknowledge this is what happened to me.
Yeah.
And I feel a certain way about it, right? But it's that we don't want to live in that space where we plant roots and we say, so now I'm going to always be angry. I'm going to always be bitter. That's not to say we shouldn't feel those things if we feel them, but it's letting ourselves notice when they're coming up and letting kind of riding that wave of emotion and then moving on. And so if we're living constantly in that space of anger or bitterness because of what happened to me, that does not necessarily lead towards any sort of liberation or recovery. That just kind of keeps us stuck again.
Right, right. So that's, yeah, I really feel you when you say that. Because that's a dilemma when we want to address this. I want to verbalize this that has been without words. And yet I don't want to make the same mistake that I think, now I'm going to say we, but with respect for we have different experiences, but that we had in religion where there is usually this us and them dichotomy and this an enemy picture of the other one. You don't want to make that mistake again now that we are outside of religion and then just blaming everything on religion. But then, as you say, I acknowledge that so many of my problems and the reason why I sometimes feel like the weirdest person in the world is because there's a part that I've not been socialized for, and I've not, like I said before, I've not been used to addressing my own needs, nourishing myself, and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that our job is to be accurate and honest about the things that have happened to us. Because if different things had happened, we would have different things to say. So we don't have to deny that it happened, but we just, there's a difference between being accurate and honest and then letting that be your entire identity, right? I'm very similar to you. I don't necessarily participate in those ex-religious groups and spaces. Or if you go to my social media profiles, you're not going to see ex-evangelical or ex-religious person because that I don't want that to be my identity.
Exactly.
Yeah. I realize that those are a part of my story, but I am so much more than those things. And so I think sometimes giving ourselves space to not only be accurate and honest, but then grow from that and not make that our entire identity can be very helpful. While also recognizing when we come out of those religious spaces, oftentimes that's a big piece of who we are. Like you said, there's everything is wrapped up into it. So we do have to be conscious that sometimes us or other people when we're real fresh out of it, it's everything we talk about, it's everything we think about, it's kind of coloring the lens of how we see the world. And so that's okay, but part of the healing process is growing past that eventually.
I have three thoughts in all at once. Okay, but one of them is that so this blends with the kind of this gaslighting piece, because coming out, you also I was also like, was it even that bad? Because I was raised to think that this was the best place to be, we are the one who gets saved, right? So that part. And yet I also want to say it's also a interpretation matter whether there is high control in religion, because I know here in Denmark a lot of churches will say, what are they talking about? This is not any intentional, at least, control.
Yeah. So just kind of is the question more along like, what would I say to that?
Yes.
Okay.
I think at this point, I
Yeah.
just want to hear
Yeah.
your reflections on mine. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, okay. I want to be clear. So when I talk about high control religion,
Yeah.
I am talking about groups and systems and religions where they are controlling many or most or maybe all aspects of your life. That could be the way you interact with people, the way you dress, the way you spend your time, money, energy, resources. That could be very rigid definitions of gender roles and sexual identity. It could be emotional abuse. It could be isolation. There's a variety of things that it could be. And the intent in those systems is that there's what we might call like a hierarchical view of power. So there's one person or group of people at the top that are dictating, this is how you must live. And here's the consequences for not doing that. And oh, by the way, God said this. So if you go against us, you're actually going against God or the Bible or whatever the higher power is. And so that can then, it not only creates this hierarchy of, there's some people at the top and then everybody else is below them, but it creates a lot of fear and hypervigilance that I could make a mistake and do one of these things or not say the right thing in response, and all of a sudden my salvation might be questioned, my eternity, am I going to go to heaven, hell,
Absolutely.
things like that. And so that can be extremely overwhelming to anybody who hears that. Now, of course, everybody can be impacted a little bit differently, but when we're in these dynamics where there's one or multiple people trying to have power over it, there's a lot of physiological and psychological effects that happen. Now, you mentioned gaslighting. I think that's, I remember the first time I started to recognize that in the context of religion, and I was like, oh wow, that is so, it so accurately describes what this thing is. Like I created you this way, but that I'm telling you, you owe me for it, right? Like I created you to be a sinner, but now you have to pay for being the thing that I created you to be, right? It really is messy. And so oftentimes then the rules within a religion play into that message, right? Part of the way that you redeem yourself or what's the word, sanctify yourself, so become, this process of justifying why you should be able to go to heaven is often through all of these rules that a high control religion prescribes for you. Does that make sense?
Yes, a lot. I just, to the first part you were saying, because when you say it, it sounds like it's very clear. This is the group at the top. They want to control you. And what I'm looking for is can it be more subtle than that even? Like,
oh yeah,
like maybe it is like that, but then we don't know, and maybe they don't even know it themselves.
Yeah. Part of the way that I started understanding and the dynamics of power and control within religion was looking at dynamics of power and control within relationships. We oftentimes see this in intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And what we know about that is that the way the power is taken is not very overt. In fact, it's quite covert, right? You don't go out on a date with somebody and they flip the table over and start cussing and you look at them and go, oh no, I'm not going on a second date with you. That's not how abusive relationships or dynamics of power and control
You're
work.
saying they are usually sweeter on the first date and then
yes, and slowly
right
over time. They
Mm.
might say something and demand something, but it's little, it's easy to write off. Oh, that's just maybe one of their weird quirks, right? They're just having a bad day. Oh, I've had that attitude before also, or I've minimized something they've gone through. So it's very easy to justify. But what we know about dynamics of power and control is that it's consistent and over time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this like slowly grading away. And I would say that most high control religions are that way too,
Right.
where they might say they're not going to come in and you're not going to walk into a church and the first day they hand you a manual of 5,000 rules that you now
No.
have to follow, right? They're going to welcome you with open arms and they're going to tell you about their savior figure and how much life is
Mm-hmm.
better, by
Right.
following this savior. And then slowly over time, they start to demand a little bit more and a little bit more and employ this rule and this consequence for not following this. And they say, well, this is the right way to do it. This is how God or our higher power has called us to do it. This is how we show we're different than the world. This is how we show that we're true believers. And so they use a lot of spiritual statements to kind of take little
Yeah.
bits of additional control. And so it really doesn't start off as this power grab. It
Mm.
starts as this relational thing. And I would say for
Yes.
most people that are in high control religions, all those little rules, they don't see them as power grabs. They see them
Right.
as the right way to live. This is the
Yes.
godly way to live. So that can really mess with you as well.
Absolutely. Everything relational messes with you,
Yeah.
tends to mess with you if it's not
Yeah.
authentic, right? But yes,
Mhm.
that is, I really wanted that point across. So thank you for that because, yeah, it's subtle and it's in all of these relationships. And what I often hear from people from the outside, also therapists, by the way, aren't you just happy to be a therapist now that you have this trauma?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Exactly.
because you
Right.
graduated and then you didn't know
Yes.
that, but
Yeah.
you need some of
Yeah.
the tools now. Um,
Exactly.
but no, a lot of people will say that you just did what the group did, and they'll have this view of it that now you're finally
Right.
free and you're out. And I'm like, but but
Mhm.
but you have to remember this important thing is that I believed it with all of me, and that's the most
Mhm.
traumatic thing in
Mhm.
my view,
Mhm.
right? What do you
Yes.
think?
Yeah. I think that it touches every part of you, inside and outside. When you think about, I can think about the way that I lived and everything from how I thought to how I acted, how I related, how I dressed, what movies I watched, what music I
Yeah,
listened to. It was every part of my life.
yeah,
And the other piece that people need to understand is that when those are the messages that we're receiving, right? This is what you have to do, this is how you have to live. Those don't just stay in our brain, they make their way down to our bodies and it
yeah,
lives inside of our bodies. So it's not as easy as just saying I reject that, or I don't go to
exactly.
church anymore, or I believe something different. We may be able to cognitively shift, but those beliefs still live in our bodies. And that's
Yes.
where we start to see some of the impact of trauma, where we go, well, that's weird. My body is having this really big response to this message that I no longer believe.
Yeah.
And that can cause a lot of guilt or confusion or shame and other physiological and psychological symptoms. And that's where we might indicate like that could be trauma that's still alive and active in your body, because in your body it is still wrong to do those things, and so it's having that adverse response to something that you no longer believe. And that's where we oftentimes have a lot of confusion, and many people don't understand that if they've not been in a religion or a cult or fundamentalism like that.
Exactly. And it can be this very tangible thing like
Mhm.
uh, don't have sex, just like
Right.
this. That's
Yeah.
very concrete, right? And you'll deal with that for a while. At least this is my experience that, that
Mhm.
takes some time, and then you kind of get used to, oh, I can do this, right? So there's a
Mhm.
rewiring there. But then also what
Mhm.
I heard you say is there's something also just a lot deeper that's rooted
Mhm.
in the religion, but it doesn't look
Mhm.
like it has to do with any of the commandments or anything very tangible like
Mhm.
that. It's
Yeah, it
deeper.
can.
It's like a way of
Mhm.
being.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
wired from it. Mm.
Yeah, I think about how many like subtle messages we get of, I think like I will do the don't have sex one, right? There's a huge message of like, do not have sex unless it's in this very specific context, right? So when you get married, and it's cisgender, heterosexual, lifelong legal marriage, then you can have sex, right? Let's say you reject that idea. You say, no, I think as long as it's two, consenting folks, whether that's one, two, three, however many partners I have, right? As long as they're safety and consenting, and this is what I'm wanting to do, great. We could engage in that behavior. But then maybe we get into that, whatever that experience is, and our body shuts down, right? Maybe there's a feeling of fear or guilt or panic or shame, or some people experience physiological symptoms that are congruent with like sexual pain disorders or sexual dysfunction disorders, and they go, well, that's really weird because I don't believe that anymore. I think it is okay to do this thing, in this case have sex with another consenting person. And so I go, okay, what's happening? Like, I think it's okay, but my body is like, no, right? And that can be very, very confusing. And that it goes beyond just like having sex.
That's
but
like
there's
a metaphor.
many other messages.
Yeah, metaphor
Yes.
for
Yeah.
a bunch of
Yeah.
other topics. Like even something
Exactly.
I remember you
Exactly.
said on, and I'm going to look at your Instagram in a little bit because I thought maybe you could get some inspiration. But you said
Yeah.
you said something about happiness. You know, the whole thing about, can I be happy? Even that
Yeah.
can,
Yes. Yeah.
be in that
Yeah.
metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah. I struggled a long time with that. Like, is it okay to be happy? Can I say that I deserve things, right?
Yeah.
Like I deserve to be happy, or I deserve X, Y, or Z, like a really practical thing, right? I mean, I grew up believing I don't even deserve the air that I breathe.
Yeah.
And so when that's wired into you to say, well, I deserve to be happy, like for a long time, I had a very visceral reaction to that. I was very resistant, even though I knew, yeah, of course I deserve to be happy, or I deserve to have the air that I breathe, right? I knew that in my head, but my body had been so trained to say, no, 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 I deserve nothing because of how awful I am. I'm a sinner.
Yeah.
And so I really like even had to work through something like that.
So
Yeah. And many other people do.
yeah, that's the programming, the sinner.
Yes.
And I don't deserve. And I think you can you start to everything is connected to that original sin. Like you are that sinner. That's also, and if you then have sex, if to use that, then you are even more of a sinner. Then you have to kind of go through the whole forgiveness.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And so being happy, isn't it? It's when you look at it, as we try now to look at it more from the outside, it's kind of crazy that you're not allowed to be happy. But it's been a personal struggle for me too, because if again, it's so with the basic, the root is the original sin, but then I just layer on top of that with all the things that I've done wrong to now confirm and reinforce that I'm not allowed to be happy actually. Because, I've also heard other people and, just continue going. There's so many reasons you can't be happy.
Yeah. And I think too, we hear that message, you don't deserve anything. You're not allowed to be happy. And, then if you leave the faith or you leave that religion, you're often told, things will happen to you for God to get your attention. So then if things happen and you're not happy, or you have negative consequences happen to you, that reaffirms again that message of, see, you don't deserve this, and you do deserve like the negative things that are coming to you. And so it's really kind of, it messes with your mind, even if you're coming out of that system. And I think it's worth noting too, that when we've been told something is bad or wrong, so you don't deserve X, Y, or Z, or you cannot be happy, then we can't just decide one day, okay, I'm going to be happy. That can feel overwhelming to our nervous system. So we have to be able to give ourselves like small doses where we let ourselves maybe feel happy or believe we deserve something for just a few seconds. And then kind of get away from that, come back to the present moment, and kind of like we're expanding our tolerance for being in some of those spaces where we can consider different things, because it's like we need muscle memory. Like we're building muscles to know, like, it's not only okay to be happy, or it's not only okay to feel as though I deserve something. It's safe to be happy. It is safe to know that I deserve air. right? I deserve, connection, things like that. And so part of that healing process is giving ourselves kind of like these incremental spaces where we can learn how to be safe in the experience of happiness.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I just have so many thoughts when you speak, and I just want to interrupt myself and say I really
Yeah.
appreciate you and
Mm,
appreciate the time that you're investing with us, and also just
mm.
your contribution to the world
Thank
around
you.
this. It's so important. It feels so
Hmm.
good, at least for me right now, to
Yeah.
be mirrored. So what
Yeah.
I was thinking about is we're talking about being happy, and we're talking about then this, as I hear you, this elation, that this elevated energy that your nervous system then have to learn to tolerate. But there's this caveat that in church, so I grew up in something very rigid. I don't think anyone
Mhm.
knew ever came in. I think you had to be born there. But in my youth, I came in, something like Hillsong and some very
Yes.
charismatic
Hmm.
churches with a lot of singing. This is my point,
Hmm.
that the singing is actually where then I was very happy. You see, so
Mm.
there's differences, different
Yes.
happinesses.
Yeah. Yeah. And religion is often very prescriptive of where are you allowed to feel certain things.
Right.
So many emotions are vilified just across the board, right? But then there's certain ones where it's like, oh, joy and elation, as long as you're feeling that towards God,
Yeah. Okay.
that's great.
Right.
But be careful. Don't get too, like what they might say, addicted to that
Yes.
feeling, because you don't want to put that over God, right? You want to be able to feel that towards God. So even when emotion is allowed, it's in a very specific box that they put it in. You can only feel it in this context.
I cannot tell you how many debates I've had on that topic. When I was in the religion, I was like, "Is this too much?"
Yeah.
Because I am a quite a fiery person, so I could easily surrender to that music. But then I felt, oh, this is too much, right? And
Yeah.
people would
Oh,
say, yes,
yeah.
it has to be exactly what you
Mm.
said. Like, don't be addicted to it. And where is your
Yeah.
focus? Is it because of the music? Is it the rock?
Mm.
Because then it's
Yeah.
not good. Or is it because of
Yes.
God? Because then it's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
Oh,
so bizarre when we think about that.
yeah.
It's so weird.
All of these thoughts, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, do we have anything more on this? Otherwise, I have another topic I wanted
Yeah,
to.
go for
Okay.
it. Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I wanted to ask if volunteering was a part of it,
Mm.
and how you look at that, because for me, it was a big and impactful part of my whole life. I don't remember ever
Yeah.
not being a
Hmm.
volunteer, and it actually, now that I'm going for job interviews, it's kind of a problem to. I had this interviewer the other day ask me about, you just like your whole life you've been a volunteer. She kind of was skeptical about that, and I had a
Yeah.
problem explaining it, trying not to name religion.
Hmm.
Anyway, and I still am volunteering because there is this
Mm.
fulfillment you get from something, and somewhat selfless service. I know it's not
Hmm.
completely, there's a lot of ego involved too,
Hmm.
but at least you don't get paid.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then there's this whole downside where I've had years of not having a place to live, I've not have an income, and I was still devoting
Mhm.
all my time and energy to the
Yeah.
church activities and
Yeah.
volunteering. So I was just actually wondering, when you talk about religious trauma, if volunteering is a part of that, because I
Yeah.
seldom hear about that part.
Yeah, I love that you asked this question because I have very strong thoughts on this, but I've never shared them publicly.
Hey,
So, yeah.
here we are.
Yeah. So, first of all, I really resonate with what you said your experience was in terms of volunteering and having to forego basic needs, things like food and housing and safety in that way. I grew up in a ministry family. My father was the director of a camp, of a fundamentalist camp. And I didn't realize until much later in life, like we were a ministry family in that we were soliciting financial support from other people and things like that. And so I know that there was many times where we did not have enough money to cover costs, but yet we were always taught that when you're working for God, like this is, God takes care of all your needs, and we don't need the earthly material possessions anyways. And then that carried over into my adulthood. I worked myself in formal ministry. I was a paid person, but then I was also expected to give a certain number of hours over that as my way of giving back to God, right? And so I was usually paid for 20 to 25 hours, and then I was expected to give about that same amount back in addition to what I was being paid for. And so I think about I'm like, obviously I grew up this was like 20 years ago. So rent prices were much different, and cost of living was much different. But I do know that I didn't and still don't have I didn't have a lot of money to my name, because I really was living paycheck to paycheck and having to decide, what do I pay for this month and what can I go without, because I don't make any money, and yet I give all this time.
Just to
And
clarify, but this was in church or after? This is just a normal job
yeah,
where you are
well,
expected to work pro bono?
I worked at the church, and then I was also expected to volunteer at that same church.
Oh,
So
right. Got it. Okay.
essentially they were paying me for half of the hours that I
Right.
was
Oh,
working.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm.
Yeah. And they always demanded more. And as I kind of I got out of that paid position, and then part of my story is that when I went back to school to become a therapist, you usually can't work full-time jobs when you're in that level of education anyways. There's just a lot of demands. But I actually ended up quitting both of my part-time jobs so that I could give more time to ministry that I was not paid for.
Yeah.
So I was, living
Oh
off of
gosh.
student loans at that
Yeah.
time. And so, yeah, so there was many times even that I would plan events, like ministry events that they would charge people for, and I couldn't even go to the event because I couldn't afford it, even though I planned all of
Oh
it.
God.
So, yeah. So all that to say, I have lots of stories about volunteering, but that is one area in my life where I've really struggled to engage in volunteer positions still, because there was 27 years of my life where I was giving. I feel like I'm still burnt out from that.
Right.
Um, and so I do think that there can be that long lasting impact. And I am all for volunteering. And part of it, I find other ways to give back that maybe don't require me to go knocking door to door or things like that. As weird as it sounds, social media is one of the ways
Yeah.
I try to give
You're here
back,
right
because
now. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I try to look at that as some of my volunteer work, because I
Absolutely.
do want to be able to help people, but this is the only way I can do it that doesn't send me into a panic. Um, and so I
Yeah.
do think that, we're taught to just give everything away and to not care about material possessions, or what is that verse in the Bible, like you store up your treasures in heaven. So it
Yeah.
doesn't matter what you have on earth, and you're told that God will take care of all of your needs. And so there's this expectation that, if you have a need, you don't need to worry about it. God will take care of you. And that's those needs don't always get met. And oftentimes people have to sacrifice things in order to stay in those ministry positions. So I can think of many parents that sacrifice the needs of their children so that they could serve God, right? Okay, well, we don't need this amount of food or clothing or time with my child,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, for
right?
me, it's been
I will
time and
just,
energy and
yeah.
focus. I'm like, why did I not look at more at my small
Yeah.
children? But I was just looking at, church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was glorified. People were
Mm.
really impressed by that. And then you certainly also can't complain if you're the child of somebody who's in a position like that.
Mm.
Um, you're also being taught that you're working for the Lord. And so
Yes.
if my need as a child isn't met and I feel a certain way about it, that's on me, right? That, like, who am I to question my parents serving God? And so it can
Right.
be very, very confusing. So I think it can lead to a lot of different kind of symptoms, whether that's, um, you know, uh, kind of like trauma, like whether that's a scarcity mindset, whether that is a deep fear of like not having basic needs met,
Yeah.
which can lead to uh, OCD, anxiety, phobias, things like that. I think it's something that a lot of people don't talk about.
Yeah, because it is twofold, at least twofold, but because there is this side of it that where because this piece that we need to say right now is why did we then do it, right? Because we have shared all
Mm.
of these negative
Mhm.
sides to it, but the reason, yeah, you say it was glorified, so there's that whole culture, but also because it's actually personally feels kind of meaningful,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Of
yeah, I'm
course.
helping you,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I don't even.
Yeah.
It's like a part of it not receiving money because
Mhm.
it makes it
Mhm.
more honest, more,
Meaningful.
yeah, more
Yeah. Yeah.
meaningful, more
Yeah.
human to
Mhm.
human.
Mhm.
But so there's
Yeah.
something around it that's definitely if
Mhm.
when it's not, without boundaries like
Yeah.
that, it's actually kind of
Yeah.
abusive.
And I think that one of the things that religion in general does very well on is tapping into human, like basic human needs, things like connection,
Yeah,
things like having a purpose that's greater than ourselves, right? And so it it has it under like religion understands here's the things we need like as basic humans in order to thrive and connect and have a meaningful life. And so it provides opportunities that meet those basic needs. And so that idea of being a part of something that's bigger than yourself, right? Which
yeah,
is where volunteering would fit.
right.
And that in and of itself is beautiful, right? It's, and there can be so much good done because of that. But I think where religion twists it a bit is their motivation behind it,
Yeah,
is that it then becomes a way to grab more control and more power and require more resources, time, and energy from people. Um, that usually then bumps up against other basic needs. Then those other things go by the wayside. And it becomes spiritualized in that, this is what we're required to do because, Jesus did
yeah.
this, or however they want to phrase it.
Yeah, it becomes into this completely way larger than me context. And actually, what I think when you are recovering from religious, yeah, from being religious, I just want to say, uh,
Mhm.
then you have to develop your ego, right? And say, I have needs, I am important.
Yes.
And it's not only
Yeah.
this whole picture where,
Mm-hmm.
that should make sense. My personal life should actually also make sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's balancing, right? It's
Yeah.
saying other people are absolutely important
Mm.
and so am I,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not about this huge imbalance where everybody else is 55 times more important than me and I'm the lowest of the low. It's about bringing that into balance and saying we are all important and that needs to be reflected in word and action.
Yeah, I've just gone to your lost focus a little bit, but I've just gone to your Instagram. That's what happens when you go to your Instagram account. And of course, to the
Yeah.
listeners, I will of course link to Laura Anderson,
Mhm.
both everything. But I
Mhm.
thought maybe just a thing that you shared, I think the other day, uh, evangelism slash fundamentalism could not exist without shame. I
Mhm.
really want to hear you say something about that.
Yeah. Well, shame is that emotion that indicates to us that something about us is wrong. So guilt is often like, I did something bad. Shame is, I am bad. And when I look at like the doctrine of original sin, that's so shameful, right? Adam and Eve sin in the garden, and therefore I now, however many years after, am born as a bad, evil, sinful person. Before I
Yeah.
even take my first breath, I'm a
Yeah.
sinner.
Mm.
Right. And you just think about the weight of that. And you come out of the womb then believing there is something wrong with me. I am bad. It goes back even to the gaslighting piece.
Yeah.
Right. But that piece of you are bad, you are evil, then provides this pathway for religion to say, you're in need of a savior, and we have that savior for you.
Yes.
And if you believe these things and do these things and abide by these rules and follow this prescribed path, then you can have this freedom, this eternity, this life that we've painted. But that only happens through shame.
Because of shame, right?
Mhm.
Because you're
Yeah,
actually not allowed to.
right.
You
Because
don't
it
deserve
yeah.
life.
Yes, yes, it hinges on that belief that you deserve nothing. So if you deserve nothing and we have this thing we can offer you, then we can make all sorts of demands that increase our power and control over you. And then that increases our cause and our mission and what we're all about. But it all boils down to this shame piece of, if I can get you to believe that you are an evil, worthless, undeserving person, then I have a lot of control over you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I
Mm-hmm.
think so. I think that if we say that the root is the original sin, then comes the shame, and then comes maybe some steps
Yeah.
ahead comes the volunteer work.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah. Yes,
it's
exactly.
all related. Like you're
Oh,
atoning
it is.
somehow. Yeah,
Mhm.
actually,
Constantly. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I thought,
Mhm.
okay, I want to do two things because I am aware of time.
Yeah.
So the first thing is I thought maybe we could share a horrible, a horrible childhood memory, and I can start,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
then you can see what comes up.
Okay.
No, it's just because that I just came to think of when I was preparing for this. I was like,
Hmm.
it's so weird that when I was a child, I call it weird, but it's just it
Mm.
seems so absurd
Mm.
that as a child, not a teenager, I know I was a young child, I was picturing in my mind that we would have, I would have my nails removed. Okay,
Mm.
hang in there.
Yeah.
Because we were told so much about Christian persecution, so that
Hmm.
if we,
Hmm.
I had to, in my mind, I would say, okay, so no matter what you do, you can take my nails out. I will still
Mm.
say that I believe in Jesus. I will not deny it. So
Yeah.
that's some
Wow.
strange thinking to have as a child, but that's something that I really was thinking a lot about.
Yeah.
Like, how will I react when they
Yeah.
come? And I also, of course, ask God once in a while,
Hmm.
can you please just forgive me? And then I deny Jesus because I really don't want
Mm.
my nails out.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that just shows a couple things. A, it shows how overwhelming those messages are to
Yeah,
children.
yeah,
I think about how often, especially Christian parents, are like wanting to shield and protect their kids from anybody who's different than them, right? And anybody who has a different lifestyle or believes or thinks or acts differently. But yet they're telling them these really gruesome stories and calling them good and loving, and that causes so much confusion for a child, because it also, there's a lot of kind of mind warps that it does and kind of messes kids up, or it can. But yeah, a child doesn't have the brain abilities to understand that, to be able to organize that and think like, oh, is this true? Is this really going to happen? Because A, they're just too little. Their brains can't do that yet. But
yeah,
B, what makes it even worse is their parents, their caregivers, the people who are supposed to love them the most, care about them the most, protect, provide for them, and keep them safe, are the ones that are telling them this
yeah,
message.
yeah,
And so it becomes believable, right? That's why little children believe in Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas, right? Because their parents tell them.
yeah.
And so they go, of course, this mythical figure is true because my parents said it was true. And then there's gifts in the stocking on Christmas morning,
Well,
right? And so,
it's a sweeter tale to to have in mind as a
yes,
child.
absolutely. But it's the same
Yeah.
phenomenon that happens within
Mm,
religion, right? So if you have your parents saying you're going to be persecuted for Christ, and as a kid, you're like, the worst thing I can think of happening is my nails being removed, which would be really painful, by the way,
yeah.
right?
I must have heard that
Yeah.
somewhere. Yeah.
Yes. And then that sticks and it becomes a real fear that lives inside of you.
Yeah.
So I hate that you had that experience. And I also want to share that so many people I've talked to have similar
Yeah.
experiences where they have some very vivid pictures in their mind of what would happen to them, um,
Do you have
because
one?
they were told.
Yeah.
For me, one of the most vivid pictures or kind of memories that stands out is there was like a children's storybook Bible that we had that was like illustrated. And one of the pictures was like supposed to be Jesus hanging on the cross. And I wanted to, well, my brand of Christianity was that you had to ask Jesus into your heart to become a born again believer, right? It's very like niche speaking. But my mom would not let me do that because she thought I was too young. But I was terrified that Jesus would come back in the middle of the night and I had not prayed this specific prayer. So I would go to hell. And so every night for years, as a small child, 3, 4, 5 years old, I would just have that image in that little children's storybook Bible, because my reasoning was if I just thought about that image until I fell asleep, then if Jesus came back, I could at least tell him I was thinking about him, like until I fell asleep. And it was just, it's, I look back and I'm like, hey, okay, first of all, that was brilliant that I came up with something like that. And B, like, oh my gosh, I was so scared back then. Like that no child deserves to be terrified to go to sleep because there's a possibility they could wake up in hell. So yeah, I do understand that. Yeah.
It is so real. It is so real. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you talk about children, I come to think about the whole definition of religious not the definition of religious trauma, because actually the listeners here, if they want to, they have a really long monologue of me speaking about that. But for me, it's kind of important to view it when, for example, in attachment theory, to have it recognized as something like that, because you were told there was this God and you kind of you totally attached to him, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
But then he was a God and he was not a person, and that's traumatic.
Yeah. Yeah. And oftentimes too, our version of God as a child is built off of our relationship with our parents.
Yeah.
So, our going back to like what we were talking about with your story is many people would say, okay, my parents loved me. They provided for me. They supported me. And they also told me these really horrific messages or made me do these things or whatnot. And that can be very, very confusing. And then that's oftentimes why it's okay for God to do the same thing, to say, yes, I love you, but I will send you to hell. And me doing that is loving you, right? Like that's where it kind of messes things up. And that does absolutely go with attachment.
Right. Yeah. I feel it's missing in the books that I read. I'm like, there should be like a little note on religious trauma there.
Yeah.
But we're getting there, I'm sure. So the last thing is just that I wanted to talk a little bit about your birth chart, Laura.
Yes. Yeah. My assistant mentioned you might want to do that.
Yes. So, and you or your assistant wrote that the only thing you knew was that you were Cancer.
Yes. Well, then I know where I was born, and I think I know what time I was born.
Yeah. No, so. I got that. I've studied your chart. I was just like, but this is the part that you know. So the Cancer part of it, the sun sign Cancer part of it, is that it's about nurturing, and it's about the internal rhythm and creating emotional attachment, so that you are connected within all of existence that can be very overwhelming. So the Cancer archetype really needs to form. It's a developmental journey, of course, but it's also something that they naturally do, that they form and feel a sense of belonging, and preferably in something like a home setting, in a stress-free, warm environment. And then it's in the 11th house, and I've mentioned the 11th house because Thomas More has his son there too, so you can be proud to be compared to him, maybe because it's a very, I call it like it's a genius house, because it's a genius placement, and you are doing a lot of different things. But okay, so you have the Cancer in the 11th, and the 11th house is also where you increase and refine the quality of life, and that means that you want to elevate both on the collective and personal level. So it could be, for example, you have this research talent, and and some different kind of intellectual creative talents. But when cancer is there, it's also that you have this objective access to the emotional, and that you are able to create safe community with
I
like-minded
love
people.
that.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the path was set out before me,
Oh,
even before I could consciously know what it was.
yeah, but that's the large thoughts. We just talking, so
Yeah.
it's like, hey, how is that connected, right? But just for recognizing your inner life, how does it feel?
Mm. I mean, it feels like it resonates, when some of the words that you use, I'm like, oh, that is absolutely me, creating that sense of like home and connectedness. That huge, it's funny, as we are talking today, I'm actually not at my home.
Right.
I came to where I'm originally from Minnesota, and so I've been here for the last month, and I notice how my body shifts when I'm not at my home, like because it's
Ah,
not my space, it's not something I've created, so I don't feel as connected to myself and to other people, or kind of in that flow of just how I do life. And maybe it could be that if this was my home, like if I were to move, but I really resonate with that idea of like connection and creating safe spaces.
yeah.
I feel that on a very personal level, and then I feel that in my relationships as well as my professional life.
Yeah, that it's actually something that you have inherently in yourself, that you need to
Mm.
connect personally to things and to places,
Yeah.
and then it's
Hmm.
absolutely your contribution that you do have a community for people, and it, the way that you share is making other people feel more relaxed and at home too. Yeah,
Yeah.
people who resonate with
I
this
love
what you're
that.
doing. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when I was still in the church, this was, gosh, probably 20, over 20 years ago. There was one of the girls in my youth group was having a really hard time with something. And I couldn't tell you what it was to this day, but I went up to her, and I just gave her a hug, and I just held her for, however long she needed to. I didn't say anything. I just was there. My presence was there.
Mm.
And she thanked me, and then a couple weeks after that, she came back and she goes, "Do you remember giving me a hug, when such and such happened?" I was like, "Absolutely." And she goes, "Something in that healed me, like the
Wow.
safety, like there was a connection there that I just knew everything was going to be okay."
Mm.
And I remember just always holding on to that, because I think even in that moment, I knew like this life that I'm living within the church, I don't think that's it. I don't think that this is what my ultimate purpose is. And I couldn't articulate what that was going to be. Um, but I can see those like moments all throughout my life of like, oh, like my true essence always did come out, but it was fragmented because of the environment I was in. And now I have the opportunity to kind of
Ah.
live in the fullness of that.
It's so interesting with memory, right? Because
Mhm.
if we are focused on sin and we don't deserve happiness, then you can, when you look back,
Yeah.
you just look at all your
Yeah.
mistakes and all
I
your
know.
guilt
Yeah.
and oh. But when we are in
Yeah.
recovery, and we are, as you talk a lot about being embodied, right? When we've come to
Mhm.
a safe space in ourselves, then it makes sense to look back and say, but that's what who I've always been, actually.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, which is, it's really cool to see, because I think all of us can do this. We were always there all along. It was always there. It just had to be shifted and fragmented or repressed or suppressed. And I think part of recovery is going, okay, that doesn't have to be there anymore. We can integrate into this whole self and be what we always were. We just
Yeah.
get to be, to the fullest now.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Mhm.
love that you're a therapist as well.
Thank you.
I know that
I know
that's
I used to have friends back in grade school who would be like, "Someday we're going to pay you to talk to." And I was like, "Okay."
yes,
They weren't wrong. Yeah.
exactly. That happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, because a lot of people have insights on religious, after
Mhm.
workings, but that you have this therapeutic angle
Mhm.
is, and yeah, you're knowledgeable like that. That's so important, I think.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Can I just take a screenshot of us? It's something that I do in this podcast.
Yeah. I love it.
And every time I'm like, can I remember? Okay, I have to press this. And then now we have to smile.
Yes.
Oh, are you there? Oh, okay. Okay. Just a minute. I have to press them simultaneously. That's the problem.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Okay, now. Here it is. But I'm looking,
There we go.
and I'm looking very focused. Perfect.
Well, we can take as many as you need.
This is good.
I love it.
Okay. Do you have anything you just feel like sharing in the end here? Or something?
Yeah, well, I'll plug my book a little bit only because you mentioned it, and you've talked about, various aspects of religious trauma. And so I do have a book coming out in the middle of October, and it's called When Religion Hurts You: Healing from Religious Trauma and the Impact of High Control Religion. And the reason I mention it because it's coming out, but also my hope is that it really can be a resource for people who are in these systems or trying to figure out what has happened to them or how to move on from it, to kind of maybe even normalize some of what they're going through, but then also open the door to hope that there is life outside of this, that we can heal from this. And so that feels really important to me to be able to say that to people, is that, religious trauma is trauma. We're going to validate that.
Yes.
Like we said earlier, we can sit there. We don't have to live there. And so this is kind of my contribution to the world, to be able to support people coming out of that, and hopefully give a doorway to something that is beyond where they've come from, in that high control sense. So maybe a doorway to, or kind of directing people towards recovery and freedom.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. And I love the title, When Religion Hurts You, right? Because
Yes.
Because then it's open. You can be religious and it's open. Maybe it's not hurt you, but when it has,
Exactly. Yes.
I'm vibing with you. Yes. Can you feel it? We're on the same wavelength.
I love it.
I get you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your time. And I also found, just before I started this interview, I found out that you also have a podcast. So
I do, yes.
I could have listened to that, but I'm going to now. It's like a Sunday school or something.
It's called Sunday School Dropouts.
Amazing.
Yeah, and so we try to have some, kind of light, funnier, whatever subjects, but then we are talking about things specific to religious trauma. So we only have about 6 episodes out, but we have many more interviews that are recorded and are waiting to be released. And so I'm excited because there's podcasts on deconstructing your faith, and then there's mental health and trauma podcasts, but there's nothing specifically on religious trauma. And so we wanted to fill that gap and provide a resource for people that are coming out of fundamentalism and high control religion and have religious trauma. And this can hopefully be another resource for them. Absolutely. So that's called Sunday School Dropouts, and you can find it on any platform as well as YouTube.
Yeah, I'll link it. I'll listen to it. I'll link it. And
yes.
Just wanna thank you again for being here and investing in us. And I hope that people can hear that you are an 11th house sun with all the different things that you're doing.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, what a pleasure.